not to scandalize any of our friends listening, but I was recently at a bar in New York City, which is something
Ooh.
a Catholic priest does. And this woman came up to me and wanted to talk exactly about this question because
Wow.
she was very concerned. She said, "You're a Catholic priest and you don't, ever." And I said, "No, like not ever. That's the thing." And she said, "But don't you want to?" And I said, "Okay, of course, that's what our nature is." And she says, but why do you live this way?" And I said, "Because it's how Jesus lived." And she could not believe it. So it was, and the point again that I'm really underscoring there is that celibacy is a distinct thing, right? Part of the Catholic tradition. This is why, Diana, I think you thought, oh, we got to talk to a Catholic priest about this. These are the only ones doing this in a kind of radical way. And it causes this question to be asked and to be had in many, many times and places. When people look at me, like I want them to say, I see something of Jesus in him. That's all I want them to think. And not so that they'll think of me or think well of me as Father Patrick, but so that they might experience Jesus Christ more dynamically and more directly.
Hello, everybody. You're listening to The Soloists. I'm Mallory Everton, and I'm here with my friend Diana Brown. And today we are talking with Sara Perla and Father Patrick about celibacy and other fun topics.
I've never had a conversation like this in my life.
Me neither.
I'm so excited to jump in. But first, Sarah and then Father Patrick, do you want to introduce yourselves to our audience?
Sure thing. I'm Sara Perla. I work at the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, which is dedicated to the collaboration of laity and clergy in all of the long-term challenges that the Catholic Church is facing. And one of those challenges is that our marriage rates have plummeted. So here we are talking about that. And I'm also 42 and single. So that's part of the story too.
Thank
My name is Father Patrick Briscoe, and I'm a Dominican friar. So for friends who are not aware of what that tradition means, it means that within the Catholic Church, I'm a particular kind of priest with a particular mission. I live in community, and unlike a lot of Catholic priests, I have a vow of poverty, which is one of the hallmarks that I hope to get into in a little bit, because I think that community life is a big part of what we're going to talk about, how I experience that and what that means. My ministry currently is that I'm the editor of Our Sunday Visitor, a national Catholic magazine. Our Sunday Visitor was founded in the beginning by a young Catholic priest from Indiana who was dedicated to helping non-Catholics understand more about Catholicism. So I feel like I'm really stepping into our founder's shoes in this episode, which is great.
you.
And I live in Washington, D.C.
Amazing. It's so nice to meet you both.
Yeah, we're very excited to jump in. So let me explain why it's like we really need to talk to a Catholic priest. We just do. And I'm very excited to have both Father Patrick and Sarah here because you represent two different experiences of singleness in the Catholic Church, right? Like one where your life has just taken you, maybe unintentionally. That's not to say that there haven't been like brave and courageous decisions you've made about what to prioritize along the way. I'm sure you could have been married if that was your sole goal. And then we have Father Patrick, who has taken vows that require singleness. So I'm grateful to have both of your perspectives. But the reason that I wanted to talk to you both is because in the Latter-day Saint tradition, we have this concept of celestial marriage where, yes, we believe that Jesus saves us and salvation is granted to everyone who goes through the covenant of baptism and keeps to their covenants throughout their life. But to receive exaltation, which is this step beyond salvation that involves eternal progression and full embodiment in the eternities, which we believe is a good thing, you need to be married and partnered, which is so different from most of the Christian tradition that takes Paul's teachings on these things a little more to the letter, where he has this notion that singleness is actually the holier state and marriage is what you should do in this life if you don't feel up for the consecrated single life. So I just wanted to go through a few things just to set the stage about how Latter-day Saints are typically taught about sex and marriage and the way that these all factor into the holy life. We definitely have a view that we're pro-sex, we're pro-embodiment, and even pro-pleasure, that the purpose of sex is not only reproduction, but also spousal bonding. Jeffrey R. Holland, who is a current apostle in the church, has a famous talk where he talks about sex as a sacrament. And obviously, the church doesn't oversee that the way they do their other sacraments, thank goodness. But that it's considered that holy as something that sort of bonds you as a couple. And that sex will be a part of the afterlife and the eternity. So we believe that marriages that are performed in the temple will last for eternity, and that you have this partner that is growing and expanding with you forever.
Yeah, we call them our eternal companion.
Yeah.
It's a heavy term.
It is a heavy term. Yeah. But that is something that we believe, and that's part of like this view of eternal expansion and growth. And then finally, we definitely believe that sex outside marriage is a very bad sin. There's a lot of emphasis on like there will be some grave psychic or spiritual damage that happens to you if you engage this. But the reason this is all interesting is for those of us who are single longer than we expected to, you end up feeling like there is absolutely no sexual expression that is permitted. You're just assumed to be a sexless, unerotic creature. And it's just unfortunate, because you didn't get married, because you haven't done that highest sacrament. And there's no meaning to it, right? Like, there's no content to our celibacy. You're just kind of stuck. And I actually think it's ironic because as much as we celebrate ourselves like, oh, we're pro-sex, we're pro-embodiment, this is really great about our tradition. In this case, I think we actually end up agreeing a lot with the secular view of sex, where we associate it with maturity and adulthood and progression and advancement in your life. I think this is why singles really struggle in our churches, because there's no dignity to it. There's no meaning to it. And it's just kind of like you're stuck in adolescence. And, we're not going to undo the fundamentals of our tradition today. That's not the point. But I did think it would be very helpful to be thinking through, is there meaning to celibacy? And can this actually be something that we look at in like a positive way and not just like very sad that you haven't gotten to like advance in your life, right? So, yeah. Any immediate reactions, or Mallory, anything you want to add to my preamble?
I think you summed it up very well, Diana, that there can be this feeling of almost being in a half-life, that there's a version of a full life and then there's this half-life. And Father Patrick, you gave us some beautiful things to read. And in this particular text, they referred to it as being a eunuch, which is what we're talking about here, that feeling of like you can either be made a eunuch by birth, you can have being a eunuch be thrust on you by the agency of others or yourself, or you can choose to be a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of God. And in our tradition, there isn't a version of that. Not really, other than like, I guess, blessing what God has given you, which if it's a zero-sum game and it's just either you're married or you're living a half-life, then it's like sometimes God gives you nothing. So I'm just so interested in reframing and untangling this pretzel of what is often a shame, embarrassment, and a sort of despair of feeling like your life might not ever be whole.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, Sarah and Father Patrick, like what in the meaning that sex and marriage has in our tradition, what feels familiar to you and what feels very unfamiliar, even weird to you?
I actually had no idea that when you think about the eschaton, which is like the fancy word that Catholics use to talk about like the end of time, I didn't realize that we differ so much in terms of whether generations still happen. So we don't think that we're still going to be having children in the eschaton. That's not part of our tradition. So that was really eye-opening to me. And I was thinking a lot about that today because that would just be too painful for me, honestly. Yeah, because to me, there's something so comforting, especially in my late 20s to early 30s, which I think is the worst time for women when you're just grappling with your fertility and you're going to all these baby showers and wedding, like all the things. Yeah. And that was so painful. But at least I had this thought of like, well, this isn't forever. And my friends now, they're mostly done having children, right? So now we're in this different phase of life where I don't feel so different from them. in the way
Yeah.
that I used to.
That
Okay.
makes so much sense to me. Like sometimes people bring up the idea of being able to have kids in the next life or get married in the next life. And that isn't necessarily the most comforting thing. It doesn't actually create a ton of peace in the present. And it does put you into a mindset of thinking that your reward in heaven is better than what you're working on right now, which is always a little
Yeah.
tricky, I think.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Yeah.
The part of this conversation that's so striking to me is that both in the tradition of the Latter-day Saints and in the Catholic tradition, all of us are concerned about what we're living for and our ideas of the kingdom. So I like this point very much because it sets us apart as believers from everyone else who is just living for the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
So right away, we're grappling over something that has so much more to it than everyday life, than how our peers who are not believers experience sexuality and their relationships, right? So we're already bringing this massive significance to these things, to kingdom living or to looking forward towards what's going to come. And one of the things that I think is so relevant from the Catholic tradition to this conversation is that we start this living for the kingdom thinking at exactly the opposite side from you all. So rather than living now for the eternal family, right, as a celibate priest in the Catholic tradition, I'm arguing, no, we're living now as we will be in heaven, right? So that's the
Mm-hmm.
fundament of the Catholic tradition is that I'm supposed to be a signpost for the kingdom. There are interesting verses in the New Testament, right? Another outside of the Pauline tradition is another great verse in Matthew where Jesus says, in heaven, we will neither marry nor be given in marriage. That's Matthew 22:38. But anyway, the point is that it's a radical sign, and this is the part that I like, because people always ask about it. So
Yeah.
that would be my preamble.
Mm.
Absolutely. There's so much here. So we read a piece called Virginity, A Positive Approach to Celibacy for the Sake of the Kingdom of Heaven by Raniero Cantalamessa. Is that how you say it?
Si,
See?
molto Italiano.
Me.
I
Excellent.
have some Italian in me. This is great.
Father Cantalamessa is a world expert on the church fathers, so the early church history. And right now
Uh-huh.
he holds a position called the papal preacher. So he preaches important events and high feasts in the Vatican. So that's just worth noting that I didn't give you some random thing from some random guy.
Yeah.
You know, this is this is
Mhm.
a major thing in our
Well, it
tradition.
was excellent. I loved reading it.
Mhm.
One line that I pulled that I would love to just spell out a little bit more. He said that singleness and celibacy is not ontologically a more perfect state, but it is eschatologically a more advanced state. Yeah. So basically, the idea is like you are already living as you are in heaven.
I have something cool to add to this. And then
Yes, please.
Sarah will certainly want to weigh in too. So my tradition, the Dominicans, the religious order that I belong to, the kind of priest I am, I was actually founded in part because of the tension of this question. So there was a movement in the south of France where people were preaching against marriage. This was a kind of wild strain of Gnostic theology, very, 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 very strange stuff. And so my project, the project of my religious institute in 1216 was to preach against this and to defend the natural goods of the human person, which includes the natural good of marriage. The Catholic Church
Mhm.
has always taught and still teaches, this is actually in the marriage rites, that marriage is the one benefit that was not lost from the fall of sin, that the natural good of marriage is the one thing that still exists from before the fall, which is a really high appreciation for marriage. So anyways, I just wanted to say that my tradition has fought and defended the natural good of marriage. And that's the point that Cantalamessa is making here, where he's saying ontologically, we don't want to say that being a celibate is better than being married, because the Catholic understanding of marriage is that it's a vocation. It's a way that God calls you to holiness.
Mhm.
So we don't want to rank them ontologically, but we do want to say that our understanding of celibacy is that it's more eschatologically advanced. It's closer to how we will be in heaven.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Well, as we've been saying, that is exactly how we speak about marriage, right? Like what they say to single people, for example, is don't worry, you'll get the opportunity to do that in heaven, even if you don't get to now. But if you have that now, you are living as you will in heaven. So yeah, it's just completely flipped. And one way in which I can see that marriage is honored in your tradition, throughout the reading, he kept referring to singleness and celibacy as a type of marriage. You're married to God, right? Is that the way that you see it?
Definitely. So this idea of preserving oneself is very important. So there's a lot of very beautiful medieval theology about this, and even some recent people who have talked about having about every person, every believer having a place in their heart that's reserved for God alone, whether you're married or not, because ultimately this is the great relationship that people are called to, a relationship with God, whom we call Father. And that the celibate in the Catholic tradition is the one who reserves the whole of his or her heart and says, it's not just this place in my heart, but I'm going to give to you the whole of my life, the whole of my heart, and that it will all belong to you, which the closest understanding we have of that is marriage. So Pope St. John Paul II understood this in a very beautiful way, and he articulated this as what we call the theology of the gift, that in marriage, you are giving yourself to the other, and that's what you receive. The marriage is a partnership of the whole of life, ordered to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. And we might more poetically say that marriage is the total gift of oneself to another. That would be one's heart, one's loves, one's sexuality, and that it's expressed physically is what's so dynamic, and that's what represents the wholeness of the gift. In the same way that the celibate reserving that action and saying, no, I'm going to remove myself from it, is a kind of consecration and a total gift of that gift to the Lord.
Wow, that is so fascinating.
I I loved that. So there's a dimension of sexuality that is experienced by celibates and a dimension of celibacy that is experienced by married men and women. And I thought that was such a beautiful way to describe sexually whole people, regardless of their expression or where they might be at in their lives.
I love that too. Actually, would you guys mind elaborating on that? Like, what does that
Yeah.
mean that there's a
Mhm.
type of celibacy in marriage?
One thing that comes to mind is the most important relationships for me in my young priesthood. I was a parish priest after ordination when I first entered into ministry. I was assigned to the care of a community. So that's what the work I was doing. I was working in a parish. And the most important relationships in the parish were relationships with people my age who were newly married, because I came to understand my life and my vocation, my openness to them, and my place in their families, which is real, by spending time with them. And I repeatedly was able to experience gratitude for the shape of my life because of the
Mm.
hardship of what they experienced. We joke about it in seminary. We call it a celibooster. Kid, you see a kid projectile vomit all over his parents, and you say, "Well, that's a celibooster." Well, I don't have to
Oh
clean
my
any of that up
gosh.
today.
I am using that word in every conversation for the rest of my life. That's amazing.
But there's a way that difference defines and enriches. First of all, so this is what the church is getting at theologically. There are very beautiful understandings of the wedding of Christ taking place on the cross. So Christ wasn't literally married, but mystically married to the church in
Right.
giving the total offering of his life by dying for us on the cross. So that's the mystical marriage of Christ, right? So there's a kind of mystical understanding of that totality. But anyway, for me in my life, understanding my celibacy by difference, by becoming friends with married people is very important. And then the ways that they introduce me to their families, allowed me to participate is very important. Sarah has experienced this a lot as a godmother in her
Mm.
life, a kind of a beautiful thing that we have in the Catholic tradition. But there are many ways, Sarah, I know that you're a part of the lives of your married friends that has enriched you.
True.
I have a question to lead into that, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because as we were talking about, celibacy is another type of marriage. You are giving your full self to God. This is one of the reasons I thought this conversation would be great to have is like, we think of just celibacy as like your obligation until you give yourself
Mhm.
to somebody, right? It's just like a default state. And I can imagine, Sarah, that being single but not having taken vows of celibacy, not having intentionally taken that vow is like a different situation, right? How does the gift that we were talking about factor into that, I suppose? And where do you find yourself in this? And I can imagine being less of like okay, here's wedding day. I'm taking my vows, whether it's to God or to this
Mhm.
person. And it more being like, I mean, this is where I feel like I'm in my life of like, all right, I guess just be God, because that's you know. Anyway, I'm just curious how you relate to this idea and whether there's been a different experience as somebody who is single but not part of an order where you took vows. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And he actually gets to that. He only gives us like a paragraph, but he points out that this is not always chosen. Sometimes
Hmm.
this is what unfolds, but it's within the larger context of love. And so I think we all agree that love is more than sex, and love is more than just that one relationship, the marriage. And so like I honestly don't feel deprived. And even though I want to be married, I've always wanted to be married. I thought I was going to have 8 children. That's not what happened. And I certainly have ups and downs with that. But when I hear, for example, when I hear people who have no faith, who talk about their escapades in the bedroom, at no point do I feel like, oh, I wish that was me. Like, it actually just strikes me as really sad. I don't want them to feel like I'm just sitting here pitying them, but I'm not.
Well,
But
I
at the
mean,
same time,
books are coming out about this. Like, this is the moment
Yeah.
where I think even secular culture is getting honest about, like, this is not like a fun way to do like dating and
Yeah.
partnership, and like the casual sex is getting old and leaving
Yeah.
people not super happy. So
yeah. And that is really clear, even just on the personal level, when somebody's like, well, we're not dating, but we had sex last night. And I'm like, what does that mean? What do you mean?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
it's just so, it just seems so much more meaningless than it could be. And I think that's something that what we're talking about today is like, and there's no meaning in giving my life or giving my body to someone if it doesn't mean anything right now, that I'm serving, that I'm loving my friend. Those all matter too.
yeah.
Something I love in what you're saying too is just, I think your comfort with your choices. I think there's something to say about hookup culture not serving as many people as, Cosmopolitan magazine would have us think or whatever. But then there's also just you being able to look at the shape of someone else's life and say, that doesn't really look like the life I'm called to. I feel comfortable with my choices. They've led to some doors closing and other doors opening. And that feels like my life to me. Diana and I have talked about it more than once. The idea that like certain kinds of marriage may have been on the table for me, but not the kind that felt right for me in my life, or certain kinds of relationships or sexual relationships, and not always the kind that felt right for me or my life. And that feels like so much of the work that we're doing here. And I'm curious about this in general, but figuring out what you're called to feels like something significant in your tradition, and that you have big questions about where you can actually take vows to give your life to God or other people. And that feels kind of intense and like a lot of pressure to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
Not to make it worse, but to make it worse within our tradition is a realistic appropriation of the effects of sin. To
Mm,
know that, yeah, actually, as I experience my life, is not an ideal and is not an idealized life. That this world is fundamentally marred, and it could
mm,
be the case that because of the latent effects of sin, something that I wanted for myself or for another is not going to be. Our choices are real, and
mm,
that there could be a choice made by another that has a lasting impact. So that's a haunting thing. Now, it's a liberating one because
mhm.
you can appropriate it as such. And you can say,
Mm.
yeah, actually, this is a suffering. So that I don't have to lie to myself about the fact that it's a
Yes.
suffering, because it is a sadness. So you don't have to say like, oh, this is some good that I'm being denied by God, or God's playing some kind of, no, this is part of the fallen world. It's
Mm,
part of the human condition. It's being redeemed because of the love of Christ, and it will someday be transformed in the life to come. I think that's important too, to understand the part of the Catholic tradition. We joke about this as Irish people all the time. My family's Irish Catholic down through the years. That's our heritage. So you can have a kind of sense of humor to it, but behind it, there's a recognition that there's a brokenness here, and it's okay to be sorrowful about that. That this isn't what I want, or what I thought I would have had the shape of my life. And you can just call it that.
That there's an inheritance. There's something I feel like I've had to embrace over, like if I really wanted to appreciate agency and see it as holy, as one of the, if not the most valuable gift God gives to us, then I'm going to have to accept what human agency has created over the ages and what we
Right.
inherit as people,
Right.
the
Right.
current landscape of everything that we're dealing with.
I think there's another really profound difference between our religions that way, in that, like, we view the fall as a positive fall. It's another thing that we typically celebrate about our tradition. Like, we view this as like them, Adam and Eve, moving into a sphere where, yes, they would be tested and they would be distant from God, but it would allow them to grow and to gain bodies. And yes to all that. But what I appreciate about what you're saying is that I think sometimes we don't have enough space for tragedy and for just naming that. And as a result, we tend to blame ourselves. And with this question in particular, that is so interesting to think about what it would be like to hear from a church leader, for example, like, it's really not your fault. Well, okay, it's not like they're like, this is your fault, but there is a sense that you got to
No,
hustle
but
to
you
get
feel
married.
it. Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
totally feel it. And the sense of it being a fallen world, I don't know. I don't know that we always grapple with that, or not like in really concrete ways. That, like, this has been something that I really wanted to bring up on this podcast, is like talking about what it's really like trying to date today. I think a lot of us like are just like, really? This is how this.
Oh, I'm so glad. This is a Cella
Mhm.
booster. Every time I think about going on a dating app, or I hear about it from basically Sarah, every time Sarah informs me about
It's really
something,
dark.
I just say a
Yeah,
little prayer, say,
really
thank you,
bad.
Jesus, for my life. I'm
No,
just so grateful for
totally.
it.
Aw,
Sometimes the
yeah.
situations where you're supposed to be showing up with such earnest desire can be feel so absurd that it feels like, I don't know, like, how am I supposed to make this work, you know? I think sometimes our positive conception of the fall can make it so we're not as willing to think about, you know, maybe I'm just part of a fallen world. And I think we can tend to blame ourselves. A question that I think single people in our tradition are just like constantly thinking about in the back of their minds, like, what's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? How did I mess this up?
I mean, in hearing us discuss this, are there any things about your tradition that you felt added to your pain as a single woman as you got older? Did you just feel like it was mostly just like, no, this is like being in America in the 2020s, you know?
No, I think that the emphasis on vocation in your 20s, while, yeah, there are options, but you do feel like, well, what's wrong with me if one of the options isn't happening?
Mm-hmm.
And I was pressured to join a religious order, and I didn't because I'm stubborn. I'm very stubborn. And so
If
it
I
was
God
may
like,
bless. That's great.
editorialize, it would not have worked. So she made the right decision.
it's true. It would not have worked.
Don't get to join and be Mother Superior from day one.
Ah.
She's got too much power. That's the problem.
No, I was very good little obedient. I mean, for like 5 minutes, but yeah, it's like people like priests, and I would go to mass every day. And whenever your daily mass goes over, they're like, "Oh, you must be a nun, or you must be going to be a sister," or the priest or priests I would see for spiritual direction, and I would just like immediately get the sense like, "Oh, this guy thinks I'm going to be a religious," and
What Sarah's describing is very real. The pressure
Yeah.
on single young people that have a dynamic expression of their faith to explore a religious vocation, either by becoming a priest. We have the girl version, you become a nun. That is extremely real.
yeah,
Interesting.
That-
yeah.
That makes so much sense to me, given that single people tend to look like problems to be solved by
yes,
everybody. And it's
Correct.
an option.
It's part
There's
of
like
that.
for us,
Yep.
it's just like, what are you
Exactly.
doing wrong? Maybe you should wear something different. Or you should do your hair different. And it's like, well, maybe you should pursue this path of meaning that because it just looks like your life. We talk about it all the time, but like you cannot hide the fact that you're not somehow living what people think of as the dream. So people tend to comment.
Yes. Well, and if nobody ever asks you out, then it's so much pressure. Also, be like, well, this can't happen. I can't get married if nobody ever wants to date me. So what am I supposed
Right.
to do? So, but I could just enter an order, right? So I
in
have
that space.
control in that space.
Yeah.
And I'm not questioning anyone's vocation, but sometimes I hear stories of like, oh, so and so is now a consecrated virgin. And sometimes I'm like, oh, she just was never asked out. Like, that's what happened there. I mean, sometimes
No.
I get that temptation because you just want the question over. Like,
Yeah.
I want an
Oh,
answer to
yeah.
this question.
Right.
And if
that
I
gives you
can
an
do it,
answer.
I'll just do it.
Yeah. A secular version of this. I have a friend who she's like 35 and single, and she's like, I think I just need to get a PhD. I need something to show people, right? Like
Yes.
that,
Mhm.
yeah. That
Yes.
sense of being a problem and wanting like something that gives people an explanation of your continued worthiness. So,
Exactly. Like when
Um,
you're at the baby shower and somebody's like, so what's going on
yeah.
with you? And you're just like, I just want to die now. Thank you. And so before I would have to think of like, what is going on with me? Do I have anything to show for myself? Like,
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I completely relate to this, but the last time I went to a baby shower, I actually did have the opposite experience. I was a little lost personally, and so I was feeling very raw and very honest about my situation. So whenever people asked me how I was doing, I was like, "I've been baking a lot, and I don't really work right now." You know? I'm a filmmaker, so
so
sometimes I
great.
go long stretches without, like, really interesting jobs to talk to people about. And I was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna own this. I have 4 roommates. I'm 34 years old. I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I feel confused all the time and lost and scared." And this woman who had a few children and she was a photographer who was, like, also the kind of sole breadwinner in her family was like, "Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing." And, like, her response was so grounding for me, and I did forget, we're talking so much about this, about the boosters and having kind of these choices and these callings that might take us down these different paths. But like, I have a meditation teacher who told a story. I think it was like a friend's dad of his mentioned that no matter what choice you make, you will regret it and it will be wonderful. And that feels very present here for me. That I'm like, oh my gosh, she thinks that my like lost mid-30s LA adventure sounds cool. And it was a good reminder for me that that does exist.
I was actually wondering if you two could explain to us this concept of vocation. And
Mm.
the word charism is one that like I feel like my Catholic friends have introduced me to. And then I'm assuming that there's some connection with that and then what Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 12 of spiritual gifts, which has been something that's been a concept, and we definitely talk about spiritual gifts in our tradition, but we just don't map them onto marital statuses at all or like your sexual state. We definitely just are like, this person's a fantastic teacher, or this person's, great at learning languages. We just have different ways of thinking about that. But I'm thinking about Paul's argument there, and Father Patrick, you were saying this earlier about having a range of ways that you can bless each other's lives, and having diversity that way is what the body of Christ needs and requires. So I'm curious about these words charism and vocation and what those mean in your tradition and what it means that we have a diversity of them.
I think most Catholics are curious about that too. So, welcome to the part of our tradition that is anxiety inducing. So
Oh,
this is like, if you want to
Yeah.
develop a good complex, here's where you start as a Catholic.
Excellent.
you
So
mean the anxiety of like, should I join an order? Is that
exactly.
what we're, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So buckle up
Yeah.
because it's real cool
Okay.
here, as you'll see in a couple of moves. So
Okay.
move number 1 is to understand that from the beginning of time, God the Father has a plan for your salvation and your life.
Mm-hmm.
You say, "Oh, great, God loves me. He
got
made
it.
me,
Yeah.
and that the plan for my life is to rejoice with Him and the saints forever to heaven." Okay, but that is literally paragraph 1 of the Catholic Catechism. Okay, next up, how do I do the plan He has for me?
Mhm.
That's where the big yikes comes in, because the plan God has for you is essentially what you choose. So technically, the root of the word vocation is to be called. And the understanding is that God is calling you to something. He's going to lead you to something. And that because of the way you are, because the gifts you have, because of any number of predilections and choices you make, some options in your life you're going to be better suited for than others. And the point of understanding, again, this idea of vocation is to say that God made me a certain way. and he gave me certain gifts, and that I have to listen to his voice to see how he wants me to use those gifts for the kingdom. So that's ultimately the vocation. Now, in a more strict sense, the church understands 4 types of consecration that are what we would call capital V vocations. And this is where the anxiety comes in, because a capital V vocation is to the priesthood by the vows I have and holy orders, ordination, that kind of religious life, the nuns, consecrated virginity, which is a kind of ratification of one's status as a virgin, but still living in the world, and marriage. And that's the tradition. So the part that we have to reckon with is this understanding of someone who does not embrace one of those 4 capital B points. And that is a very live discussion right now in the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
Wow, fascinating.
Do you have any sense of the numbers or demographics of, say, the single community that might opt for for these particular options?
Sarah will, she's an expert on this.
That's
When you look at how Catholics have followed their vocations in recent years, we've seen a decline in men ordained to the priesthood, but it's not been like disastrous fallout. It's a slight decline, but it's basically been the same for 30 to 40 years, honestly. Then you look at women joining religious communities, and that number is way down. There are far fewer young women joining religious communities, becoming nuns, than in past years. And then you look at the statistic of Catholics getting married, and between 1960 and today, that number has been cut in half.
Wow.
I mean, that is like falling through the basement. And so
Mm.
marriage, we understand as sacramental marriage that's been ratified in the church, et cetera. But that is big time, scary time.
27.7% of Catholics in the US are single. So that's
There we
a
go.
lot.
Okay.
Wait,
Okay.
27.7%
27.7.
that's
Oh.
are never married, have never married.
Can I ask, just while we're on this topic of vocation, Father Patrick, would you mind talking about your experience in figuring out what you felt called to?
Yeah. Again, it's something that can be very anxiety inducing for a young Catholic, because you think,
Mhm.
okay, the Lord is asking me to do a particular thing. So I have to find out what is the thing God is asking me to do. So I have to listen hard. And if I don't listen hard enough, I'm going to get it wrong, and then I'll be sick.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, like, those are the stakes. This is how Catholics roughly understand this, right?
Brutal.
Can I just
So
say, it reminds me so much of just the way that we think about the choice of who to marry. Like, people
Yeah.
will be in total, like, internal anxiety fits completely about that question. And I've heard this a million times of like, everything looks right, but I just don't feel like that confirmation from God. And anyway, it's just very relatable,
Mhm.
right? Like this idea that God has a plan for you that you sort of have to divine and intuit. And are you in tune enough to really get the answer? Anyway, so we get very anxious about that. It reminds me of that, I suppose.
So my experience is that my father's a convert to Catholicism, but just after his conversion, he became very active in our local parish, in our church. And I grew up with a very supporting environment for the faith. I went to Catholic schools. My whole world was St. Charles, our parish. All of our activities were there, scouts, everything. So it was very important. And because my parents were so involved in our church community, priests were often in our home. They were just
Mm.
normal guests. That we were familiar with them. Our priest knew us by name, which was saying something, because our community was massive, a really big church. So that relationship was special to have with the priests. And I think because of that, I always had a high appreciation for them, for these men. So I wanted to be a priest from the age that I was very young, which is a normal enough thing for Catholics. Just say like, oh yeah, there's a priest I admire or a sister I admire. Maybe I could be like that. Maybe. So I went to seminary after high school, studying for my home diocese, so to be a priest in Northern Indiana. And it didn't sit well with me, interestingly, because I really liked the community of the seminary. And I knew that when I finished seminary, if I stayed in this formation program to be a diocesan priest, which is just a typical Catholic priest, the guys that wear black with the Roman collar, like the thing you normally think of when you think of Catholic priest. If I stayed in formation to do that, I would be lonely.
Hmm.
And this kind of haunted me. And it was resolved when I met a Dominican friar who was, in fact, one of the professors at the seminary, and got to know him better and came to understand religious life. Because my guys, the guys in white here, we live in community.
Mm.
And the shape of our life is bound by a set of structures that are so magnificent that I can honestly say I haven't been lonely for a second in my Dominican. So this kind of resolution was allowed for me because of the people that God put in my life and because of my recognition of my own desires, what I was longing for.
I was so struck by something, the Cantala Mesa reading that you sent us on the topic of potentially choosing what sounds like a possibly lonely life. Um, Writing about the life of a priest, essentially, and saying to live in the midst of the world with no desire for its pleasures, to be a member of every family, yet belong to none, to share all sufferings, to penetrate all secrets. I'm crying. I cried when I read it before, too. To heal all wounds, to go daily from men to God, to offer him their homage and petitions, to return from God to men, to grant them his pardon and his hope. It I think it struck my heart for a reason. I feel that in my own loneliness and my own calls as well. And I know it's not the same thing and I haven't taken the same vows, but I have found my life to be holy in those moments when I have belonged, when I have been a member of every family but belonged to none. I've felt that so many times. And yeah, I guess I just want to say I salute you and I see you.
I can't echo this enough because that's the idea of the self gift, right? Like you've just poured
Right.
yourself out for God and for his people, and that is repaid in your heart in full. And it's so
Mm.
true. To begin to enumerate the blessings I've received in my life through my priestly ministry. I mean, it's unbelievable. My my life. It's never what I would have imagined for myself. A huge part of that is the way that people share themselves because of the fact that they know that I am given totally for them. That's what my life means to carry whatever else they're carrying, to plead on their behalf before God and to live a life that's really for someone else. But I think there's a cultural pressure, avoid celibacy, the cultural pressure to be dismissive of your virginity, the cultural pressure to give in on these things, which is so enormous that
Mm.
young people fail to see what it means to just be able to pour yourself out in this way. Candida Mesa says that the young men and women are pressured by their surroundings to be ashamed of their chastity and to do everything to hide it, which is
Mm.
it's true. Young people lie about it because they don't want others to know that they're guarding their
Yeah.
heart in this way, or that they're that committed to this way of life. But then when you do share it, it opens worlds for you and for them alike. And that's certainly what I experienced again by difference with those families in Providence. But that's part of what it was because they knew that my life was for them and for their children and for our community.
I think so often how when it comes to the question of sex, people will be like, oh, well, it's not natural to not have sex. It is natural to have sex. And therefore that there's something like off the path uncreaturely about being celibate. And
Mm.
it's like, isn't there also something so totally natural about those transcendent moments of loneliness when it is just you encountering God
Yeah.
and being so radically apart from relying on any other human being for that connection? That's also natural.
You know,
And
when I'm feeling a bit combative, Diana, what I would tell my college students at Providence College, I would say, name me all the people who have died from not having sex.
yeah, there you
Okay,
go.
because plenty of people have
Right.
contracted other things. Yeah,
Mhm.
so, so I think
Yeah,
we're,
absolutely.
we're clear here that this is not a de facto natural good. This point that you're making about wholeness still being possible is a really important one to underscore. That you're not broken because you're unattached or you're not missing out on something.
Yeah.
And that not only are you whole, but you're actually able to be open in love and that there are new horizons there that are possible. Every person has passions and desires that need to be transformed in love, that need to be redirected, that need to be restored and reordered for any number of reasons in their lives. And this one is no different.
Mm, absolutely.
Sometimes I think about all of the diet and wellness trends that are like, listen, our caveman ancestors ate this way, and so we should eat this way. And like this and that is like, we weren't built for this. We should be sleeping like this. And one of the things that I feel like it doesn't invite into the conversation is the intention that like whether you believe in a God or just like an evolving universe, that we were meant to evolve, that we were meant to like work with these tensions and figure out how to move beyond them. And we seem to be transforming into something more beautiful and capable of being able to discuss things at higher levels of spiritual consciousness and intellectual consciousness. And that's where the conversation really needs to go is what are we made of and what do we want to be and where are we going with that, instead of feeling like there's something unnatural about fighting what is in our bodies for us to experience that honestly the tension, which makes things honestly interesting. It's something we can give to God. It's the traction that helps us move forward a lot of the time.
Definitely. Sarah, you've been nodding vigorously to a lot of this. I'm curious which parts have resonated with you.
I was just thinking about this section in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, where he talks about how if human beings were like gathered around a stage and there was a plate and they were bringing up a plate with a chicken on it and everyone was going, what? like, yeah, right, to get some of that chicken, then you would know that there's something wrong with how the human beings were engaging with food.
Mm.
And so in a similar way, it's so obvious that the way human beings right now are engaging with sex, with pornography, with all of this stuff, that like you can see that this human passion has gone off the rails by action. And unfortunately, I think most people do recognize that there's a beauty in Father Patrick, but my experience of realizing that I have to bring something up on a date is not, oh, how beautiful.
Preach.
So,
How many of those dinners did you end up paying for?
funny.
Oh.
So it's like human beings have made choices, and sometimes when they see someone making other choices, they do not like that.
Yeah.
And they don't find it interesting or attractive. In fact, it almost like scares them, is the way I've felt. Like, oh, interesting. He hugged me last time and now he's like shaking my hand to say goodbye. Bye.
Yeah.
So
There's so much there that we just are in a place right now as a society, and in America at least, where we don't respect religious choices in that same way, at least not in the dating landscape. And then, yeah, there's this other thing too that's like, is it about the sex? Is that what it's about? Or is it about a person who really knows what they want and the other person doesn't know what they want and they don't like being around somebody who knows what they want? I don't know.
The way that I would think about that encounter where they're like shaking your hand goodbye. Just to be honest, I really do believe this. I'm not just saying this to make ourselves feel better as somebody who's also experienced such encounter. Maybe on the surface, some people are like lame, boring. I bet a lot of people are also experiencing like, wow, that's a person with a lot inside that I actually don't know if I can meet them there. And so anyway, that would be my suspicion of what's going on in their brains and why that handshake might feel like some kind of rejection, but I actually see it as some kind of like respect in a lot of ways.
No, I think that's right, Diana, and I love it. I think because I think it's signposting, and I think it's causing people to reflect on who they are, exactly the way that a woman who's had a couple drinks in a bar in New York reflects on her life and sees a Catholic priest there and says, "Oh, here's the thing I have to ask."
I like that idea of signposting, though. Instead of feeling this constant, like, oh, I'm missing out, I'm being rejected, I don't belong. Instead, seeing it as like, there's a purpose to this misfit that I feel, this dissonance that I'm feeling with other people because I'm signposting for a world that is not yet, that is coming. Yeah.
Mm.
I love this quote along these lines. Diana, you pulled this one from the text. We are still living with the old romantic illusion that the highest happiness, the great significance, the only romance in life consists in our relationship with women and in the sensual satisfactions we derive from them. We forget only one thing, that the soul and the spirit are just as real and strong and demanding as the flesh. They are much more so. And that if we allow the flesh everything it asks for, this is to the detriment of other joys, other marvelous realms which remain close to us forever.
That feels so real to me. Like, I understand that sexual desires are so natural. Yes, 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 yes. But also, I just can't imagine my life without the calls of the soul, which is not to say that I honor them the way that I should all the time or that I'm some kind of holy person. I don't think I am. I can't imagine existing without feeling like exactly what he said there of how fully natural and important and vital those are and how like cut off we feel from ourselves if we don't know that part of ourselves.
So, some of what we're discussing is when human beings or other appetites become almost idolatry, and we use people to escape. Like one of the quotes I pulled from the text too was this: "Our hearts are free to love everyone without wanting to possess anyone."
Yeah.
Oh, that's so gorgeous. It reminds me of this bell hooks quote. Um, Knowing how to be solitary is central to the art of loving. When we can be alone, we can be with others without using them as a means of escape. And that feels like what we're talking about. We're talking about living in a way where you can fully give yourself to life and to other people. But I find it so difficult to be like, when is my pursuit of this life becoming an idol?
There's this great line in the Second Vatican Council, which was the tumultuous and historic meeting of Catholic bishops in the 1960s that created a path for the Catholic Church's engagement with the modern world. There's a line from the Second Vatican Council that declares that the human heart is such a mystery. I should quote it exactly. The truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate word does the mystery of man take on light. Okay. And the claim is there. What does that actually mean? That actually means that you cannot actually know what is in your own heart without Christ, and that only Christ reveals the depths of your heart. And so I think what people are doing in these cultural expressions, when you're hooking up, when you're pursuing other relationships, people are trying to find out what's in their heart. They're trying to discover who they are. They're trying to find the thing that's missing. But the church's claim is that only Christ can do that for you. Only God can reveal to you the thing that you're looking to know about yourself. Only God knows what's in the mystery of your heart, and that you can't even discover it in your own heart without God. And that's a pretty radical claim.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so fascinated by the way that we make such an idol of romance and give it such godlike proportions.
Yes.
We do.
Yeah.
Not just religious people. Like sometimes I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, everybody looks like they've got a God-shaped hole out there. Like, everybody, like,
Mhm.
why do we want partnerships so bad? And it feels like it's this wanting so bad something that helps us know our hearts. And I definitely believe that marriage and romance can be like such beautiful things, but it's not. Yeah, like
It
I
won't do
definitely agree
that
with
for
what you
you.
say.
Yeah.
It
It
won't.
won't do that.
Wow.
And that's what's so interesting about this conversation too. Like I've never been married, so I can't speak for experience, but I know married people. I know,
Some of my best friends
Um,
are married people.
but it's just definitely not like bliss.
I had a friend who once told me that she did think that there were times in her life that she would have chosen marriage over God. And I thought that was
Yeah.
a very big realization. But now she is married, and I don't think she has that temptation anymore,
Right.
Oh, fascinating.
right?
Yeah.
Because when it's real, you also understand or you're living in the flaws as well. And you know that it's not perfect versus having the temptation of thinking, well, everything in my life will be easier if there was someone else who was like doing this with me.
Yeah.
Well, no,
No.
Not true.
Yeah.
Uh,
What all of this seems to be speaking to is like, again, the difficulty of singleness is like how tempting it can be when you don't yet have marriage. You can keep looking for that, assuming that
Mm.
that is what you're looking for.
right.
And sometimes we are literally told that's what you should be looking for.
Right.
And to accept being single is sometimes even frowned upon, right? People will say, like, oh, don't get jaded. Don't give up with the search. Don't give up. Don't let yourself go. And sometimes it's like, what if I'm just actually settling into reality, right? And not making an idol of marriage and romance and just like really soaking in, like, I have access to everything that I need because I have God.
I would be curious for the people who are accepting that their reality is current celibacy. I wonder what are ways that you could turn toward that instead of turn away from it and embrace it in your life.
Mm.
I've mentioned it a few times just as the nature of my priesthood and the way that I live my religious life is the call to community to really be committed to something and to be extremely intentional about it. Sarah's very good at this as a friend. She's a very good friend. And it's something that she's very intentional about. We were going back at one thing over another, and I hadn't showed up at a gathering at her home. And I got a message from Sarah like, hey, you need to be here at the next. I'm just like being very clear, like the terms of our friendship were on the line. And it's not that I was being summoned, it's that she was saying, no, I'm committed to you in friendship in this way and in my life. And you need to know that. And so when I showed up at Sarah's father's funeral, I could say to her, oh, we're real friends. I'm here to pray with you and to grieve with you. And that doesn't demand that kind of commitment in life. Because you say, oh, I don't have this one commitment, therefore I can have no commitments. And so young people in the Catholic tradition, young people bounce around from church to church to hear the priest they like preach or whatever other BS, becomes part of their reason for not actually owning up and becoming part of a place. And they do that with the clubs they pursue and the hobbies they join. And all of it's, an expression of community and seeking, wanting to belong. And it's all nonsense because at the end of the day, they won't sacrifice.
Mhm.
So that's my stump speech. That the real community demands actual commitment, and the sign of actual commitment is sacrifice. And if people don't understand how to do that in their lives, they'll always feel it. And that the church can be as welcoming as it wants, but people have to actually be as committed as the church is already to them.
Wow.
That makes so much sense. What was coming up for me while you were talking too was the idea of pure friendship, that celibacy offers this ability to be like, I'm not trying to have sex with you, especially like male to female or people who are attracted to each other potentially, like possibly naturally attracted to each other, to be like, I'm not trying to own you or possess you. I'm not trying to get you to validate my existence. I care about you. It can feel rare in those types of relationships that a person is offering true friendship with no agenda.
Yeah. Another thing I really liked in what you said, Father Patrick, was this idea that the church can be as inclusive as it wants, but you have to show up to your own life.
Mhm.
And like commitment is that, right? I totally recognize this in myself. There's been so many times I'm tempted to be like, these people don't get me. I'm not, and there's always room to grow on and things like that. But yeah, like figuring out, okay, but where am I? And am I here maybe because I'm letting my insecurity in this space or my lack of direction, or just like, honestly, sometimes I am jaded or whatever. I'm alienated from myself. And anyway, I really like that point that we have to learn how to show up in our own lives.
Right.
Sarah, a question that I would have based on Father Patrick's description is like, how do you build that structure of commitment for yourself when it's not built in? You don't like wake up to 3 kids or to like a particular set of responsibilities you've agreed with. And it's more of like, I need to create this. What is that? How have you done that for yourself?
Well, I think it started 15 years ago, about when I was having one of many crises. A priest told me, like, okay, you need to pick a few friends and you're going to see them once a month. and you're going to plan it and you're going to make it happen every single month. And you're just going to do that. So I have one friend that we've seen each other once a month for the last 15 years. And since that happened, she's gotten married and had 3 children and all that time, but she made it happen every single month and I made it happen every single month. And once you see like how good that is with one person, you're like, okay, I can do this and I can do this with other people. And then you have to be open to them not wanting to do that. And then you have to be open to like, I used to every week I would have dinner with my friend and her 5 children and I'd help cook and I'd be involved. And then they couldn't do it anymore. Like it just didn't work with the kids are playing soccer and they're not home on Thursdays or whatever it was. And so things change. So it's both structure and flexibility. It's never static. And I wish it were because I'm an extrovert. I really need people, but I live alone. So I need to know that I'm going to see human beings every day somehow.
Totally.
I so relate to that.
Especially now post-COVID when like not everybody even goes to work anymore. And I could go to work and not even see another human being in my hallway, So in a way, it's like the way I'm built, I know what I need. And to get what I need, I also need to sacrifice to get that. I will say that like when I saw Father Patrick arrive at my dad's funeral, I was just really moved. And actually the whole experience around my father's death taught me like friendship. I only wanted to see people that I had known for 20 years. I didn't want to see anybody that was a new friend. In fact, some of those people reached out and I was like, I can't talk to you.
Yeah.
I only want to see people who I've been with for a long time. And I think that's hard to really understand when you're younger because you don't have those people yet. So that's another richness that comes with age, regardless of whether you're single or married, is that you have friendships that are long and have seen the test of time.
Yeah.
But I would also add, if we're talking about what makes the single life doable, and we've talked about how the spirit and the soul like need to be engaged, and we haven't really explicitly said like you have to be praying, have to be like engaged with God every day to not go crazy because he's the only one who can really fill that role. And in fact, I was with a friend, one of the ones who has 5 children, and she was like, I realized I just never prayed and I realized I missed God. And I was looking at her, I was like, oh my gosh, if I didn't talk to God, I'd have no one to talk about to ever. I'd have no one to talk to when I get up in the morning. I'd have no one to talk to when I go to bed at night. So in a way, because I don't have marriage, I have this intimacy with the Father because he's it. That's all I got.
Yeah.
Except for the cat. But so prayer.
Cat's answers tend to be less satisfying, I'll be honest.
True. He's sitting right over there. He's like, why are you talking?
I also have my cat right. Very
Childless cat lady.
Yeah.
Woo.
Mallory, do you have a cat too?
My roommate does.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's called. My allergies are starting to act up.
Yeah, where is it?
Yeah. Well, I love your prompt, Mallory. I was wondering if we could go that direction too. Basically, those points that help make the single or celibate life possible. And community was one. What would you add to that?
Well, so I would extend Sarah's point about the importance of prayer and dynamic and living relationship with God, because ultimately it's God's grace, it's God's own inner life that's going to sustain that. And I think there's a really important understanding there for Catholics that we would have of this is that prayer is not just the mental exercise of one's own conversation with God, which is true, it is that fundamentally, but also the sacramental expression. So the rites and rituals that are part of the prayer of the church. So Mass, which Catholics attend are obliged to attend on Sunday. That's the gospel command, but is available to Catholics to attend every day in most places, which is so living and rich. And then the practice of making a regular confession, which every Catholic who is serious about their spiritual life will do monthly. And the point of a regular confession and the Catholic understanding is both the movement of self examination and self accusation to say, these are the places and ways that I've come up short, and calling on heaven for the outpouring of grace to meet those failures with renewed vigor and strength. And I think that's so important because if it's just you, your faults aren't as known. When you live in a religious community, such as I do, most of your faults are very public, and your brothers are, hypothetically, very free to remind you of your faults.
Yeah.
So
They
that's
could
very,
confess for you.
yeah, exactly. It's a very present reality in religious life. And, same in marriage, right? And in fact, sometimes when you're in the confessional, you have to tell married people not your partner's faults, your own. Like these people will come in, I won't say who they are, they're old ladies, and they complain. And you're not there to confess your husband's sin. But the point of the sacramental life, the Eucharist, the regular practice of sacramental confession, which is auricular, the announcing of your sins to a priest in a private forum, is that dispensation of grace from God that makes living those more difficult moments possible. And people overlook that. They don't understand the value of it. They think, oh, these guys are just like white knuckling it. No, man, I'm just living the ride. It's just the wave of grace. It's the will of the Father. And that's what makes that disposition possible.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to underscore that point.
One thing I really like about this concept of confession as something that you just do regularly is it's less about the event of sin and more like a general condition. And there's an intimacy that's afforded in confession. Like you just allow yourself to be known by the priest, by God, and certainly the self-knowing, right?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Just the overall approach of understanding that you're a human being and you're not a full sinner or a full saint. And the active, like the reason our religions have rituals in them is so that we can engage with that reality every day.
Yeah. And absolutely. And I want to push on that and carry it further, right? And say, like, what this engenders is not an acceptance of sin, because, yeah, all of us want to cast sin off in our lives and grow in holiness and build virtue and thereby live more fully and more completely. But it allows us a kind of realism, a kind of healthy attitude about the temptations that are going to come our way. It puts us face to face with them and helps us to move beyond them. And I think that beginning with a practice of regular confession, which most people think is oppressive. I think when people talk about Catholics going to confession, it's actually liberating. And that this is the kind of thing that that can actively engender a healthy understanding of temptation and sexuality that allows you to flourish.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Another point that we had on this question of what do you need to in order to do celibacy well? This idea of the custody of the eyes that Count de la Mesa brought up, and he said this is a special temptation for people today. I'm curious if you could elaborate on that and what he meant by that and what that has to do with celibacy.
Count de la Mesa says visible things exert their formidable power of seduction over us, precisely by making us forget that they are transitory.
I wrote that down as well. Their beauty is such that they appear to a spirit still enslaved by matter to be everlasting, although we can see with our own eyes that they wither and decay from one day to the next. I had never thought of it that way before, that one of the dangers of really getting too attached to really anything that we tend to value about this temporal existence, whether it be certain types of beauty or art or status or wealth or power, that those things decay and move, that think of them as idols, as God, as something that can save us, but that they're literally set to die. Like the trend will end, the fad will be over, your beauty will fade. I've never thought of it that way before, that the transitory nature is what makes it dangerous.
One connection that I'm already thinking of with the celibacy, chastity conversation, I was talking to, he was actually a Buddhist monk because they also are celibate, or at least some of them. But
Mhm.
he said that one of the practices that they do is like if they start feeling desire towards somebody, is meditate on this person's skeleton.
Mm.
And the idea being like all of us are flesh and bone and we're all headed towards death. And like,
Oh, I
yes,
love that.
they
That's so
might
good.
be they might be like looking hot, looking fine, but like we're all the same thing. And anyway, totally reminds you that this is a transitory thing, right? And that if you're trying to be oriented towards what is eternal is aging and death. And if you want to be engaging with people in that way, you want to be able to think past this moment of seduction and this moment of like, it's looking good in my eyes, you know? So anyway, seeing past the immediate image to like remembering the material that we're made of and
Yeah.
the skeleton. Anyway.
Yeah. So I love that practice. I'm going to do this. I love this. The other main discipline of my life as a Dominican friar is living poverty. And it means not that I'm like constantly in a state of deprivation, it's not like that. We have health insurance, it doesn't mean that. It means that my life is simple and that I could fit in a minivan, if I had to move. Like really the only thing we own in our tradition, and it's not mine, it belongs to our order, but we have books. Like that's what I'm going to take with me when I move from place to place. And so the simplicity there that underlies who we are. And the reason that we're not storing up things here is to make ourselves more adept for the service of the kingdom. And also, the sense of poverty and simplicity that we're inculcating in our lives is a kind of fasting from all the transitory things that we see around us. And it's a way of resisting. And I think this is so important because of how absolutely fundamentally materialist American culture is from start to finish. I think it is so important to be simple and to declare, I don't really need that thing. Which, as a single person, I imagine would be a very great temptation. Disposable income and an Amazon account. Like, God help you. So, it's just so easy to say, well, buying this thing that I don't really need will make me feel something at least. But I think that the practice of living simply in the Catholic tradition is always called poverty, but living true to that allows a self-mortification and it heightens our attention to the things that really that are the eternal things we should be pursuing.
So you're saying I shouldn't have bought that cat pillow I bought last week.
I would never indict you on the soloist.
It's really cute. It makes me so happy.
Does the cat like the cat pillow? Or is it more of a cat pillow for a
It's
person?
actually
The cat.
sitting with the cat pillow right now.
See,
When he
it was
catches
worth
mice,
it.
does he take them to the pillow?
Those are for me.
I love it. Well, as we're going through some of the things that Cantalumes have brought up, I'm curious about this idea of hygiene and self-care as a part of a healthy celibate life. To me, when I read that, I was thinking about sort of being a body, still like loving, respecting, taking care of, nurturing your body. But I would love to hear you expand on that, talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there are many needs that people pursue wrongly when those fundamental things are disordered.
Mm,
Like
sure.
a lot of times I get back to my room and I've had a hard day and I'm tired and I'm sad. And I've also had nothing to drink all day except coffee. So maybe I just need to drink a couple glasses of water and that's the cause of my headache, right? So recognizing that sometimes what we are inclined to diagnose immediately as a spiritual problem could be a physical one. And that we can remedy those things. So you say, oh, my life is so full of anxiety because I haven't secured my vocation and I don't have my partner and I'm not sure yet about so many things to come. Well, did you go for a walk today? Like, did you do anything physical to make you actually tired? Because if you didn't, that's probably going to be part of why you're not sleeping very well. So I think this point is extremely important, again, so that we don't spiritualize or supernaturalize problems that are really just physical problems.
I love that so much. I struggle with anxiety, and I didn't really know for a long time. I was just like, I'm
Mm.
just a perfectionist and a person who has a lot of stress. But aren't I cool and too much? But when I finally realized that there were physical things that could not just affect my anxiety, but affect my ability to feel that I was connecting with my spirit and to feel that I was capable of, like in our, we call it feeling the spirit, being able to receive direction in my life or feel motivated in a way that I felt like God was a part of. It became, I think, liberating. There's a kind of despair you feel where you're just like, I'm just not going to feel good today because I slept for 2 hours and all I have is coffee, like you were saying, or like I just don't have what my body needs. But I think it's mostly a comfort to know like there are some physical prerequisites for you to be able to align properly with your highest self, with the thing that you're trying most to pursue in your life.
Really. Which is a huge irony, right? Of like this culture that we're talking about where sex is like that image of the chicken on the platter from
Oh,
C.S. Lewis. Like how interesting that oh yeah, we love the body, we celebrate the body, but we're always hunched over our screens. People are talking about that.
right.
We eat there's so many things you could say about modern nutrition and processed foods. And anyway, I'm not gonna like go on a
Right.
soapbox about any particular thing. It's not like I'm an exemplar of
Does
any of
this
these
go
things.
on YouTube? They're
But
going to cancel us.
but it's just
Talk
to
about
say,
vaccines next.
oh dear, hot
We won't go
topic.
there.
I'm not a scientist. So I don't have enough to say about any of those particular things. But like, there's so much that goes into being a body and taking care of a body that like, if we want to be pro the body, there's quite a bit besides being attentive to your sexuality.
Hmm.
I
This
also
has
like
been so
this
lovely.
idea.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I
No,
did also like this idea about, there's such a sensuality that is still available to you, even if you're not having sex, right? There's so many sensual experiences about being alive, enjoying food, enjoying a walk and stretching your legs and the sun on
mm.
your skin. And like,
Sarah has a candle and she just showed us on
oh,
her screen. That is such a good
smells and
example. I'm such a candle
fragrances
girl
and
myself.
exactly. Yeah. Anyway, opportunities to like soak all of that up.
Yeah, it seems like it requires all of your faculties to be able to make intentional decisions with your life. We don't always have all of them, but it's helpful for us to make intentional decisions. And as we're starting to figure out what we like to be on our plate and whatnot, there's almost a gratitude practice in not having certain things because it forces you to look at the whole instead of just look at the things that we stress the most in our culture. Like the chicken on the plate, like that's the most important thing in our culture. But you look around and there's a plate and there's a room full of people and there's all this stuff around you. And I don't think you can escape that when it comes to the body and all of the pharmacy of the body and how much it really has to offer you from a spiritual standpoint, especially when you're engaging your spirit and when you're actually really using your body with gratitude, which is something that was a big switch for me when I started working out with gratitude instead of with like, I'm supposed to meet some kind of beauty standard. It changed a lot for me when I started recognizing that it was a prayer. And that's one of the things I'm going to be taking from this. I think that I'd like to approach my body as a source of abundant joy and information and helpful love versus needing it to do any particular thing that is directed to me by the broader culture.
Can you imagine if young men today watched operas instead of pornography?
Oh, gosh. Wouldn't that be nice?
Like, what is it? What is it that just takes you up and enraptures your senses? People need to find those things. And there's a reason why our cultures have labored so intensely for this. I mean, Wagner is just like overpowered.
Hmm.
You hear him
Uh-huh.
extend those moments. Tristan needs all the theme comes on and your soul like it's ready to burst if you're really
Right.
listening to it. And I think that a diet of quick and thoughtless consumption has dulled us to the kinds of things that are extraordinary. And that by intentionally recovering them, we're building back, we're returning to some of the things that our forebears had already discovered. This is why temples are beautiful, for example, right? This is what it's supposed to do. You're supposed to be caught in this tradition that lifts your spirit up.
Okay, so we talked about tradition, custody of the eyes, holy friendships and community, good
At any
practice.
given moment, I'm going to like simultaneously start drinking coffee, alcohol, and smoke a cigarette just so super triggered.
Sounds like an I can do all those three at the same time.
We love it. We love a complex character.
Okay, we're obviously striking that from the record, but
Yes.
unless you want to use it as an episode teaser, and then maybe
Oh, sure.
Hilarious.
Generosity and courage and service that allows self-forgetfulness were also on the list here. Where would you go with that, Father?
Yeah, perfect. So I put those on. Generosity is a super important one, especially from my experience of religious life. So let me do this up here. So when you think of the ways, again, that we're called to discover who we really are in the Catholic tradition, this is articulated as we were sharing through John Paul II's claim that the self finds a self in gift, that you discover yourself in self gift, and that only Christ can reveal to you how that gift is made. So in order to, it literally means in order to offer that gift, you have to give yourself away. You have to be generous. And I think the thing that people are most guarded about today is time. So I was talking about this when I was mentioning really being committed to relationships and to community, but to actually be generous in what it costs you and to step up and to volunteer and to make those opportunities available. So Sarah wrote a great essay for my publication on this point about how a lot of people approach the church waiting to be served by the church. They're like, well, I don't belong in this community because I'm not married and everyone in this community is. Therefore, I can't find a place here for myself. So this is a very painful thing for young Catholics. If you show up at a mass, you want to be married, and you're surrounded by people your age, and they're all married and they all have kids, and you just say like, well, this sucks.
Yeah.
Because you just look around and you just see an ocean of what you want but don't have, right? And so resentment can build, and you can begin to say, well, this community owes me because I don't have what I want, right? So you can begin to allow that resentment to dominate and believe that the community should be giving you something because of that lack that you're feeling. When in fact, exactly the opposite is true, that you will only feel fulfilled when you give to the community, and that you are not going to receive something unless you first make a gift of it. And this isn't just a point about tithing. It's not just a point about time. It's not just a point about attendance and participation in certain kinds of service opportunities. It's the understanding that you really only find your heart when you're giving it away, and allowing those moments of self-gift to be the kinds of things that are fulfilling instead of demanding that something be taken back from me. So if I've learned that lesson once, I've learned it 1,000 times, and I'll probably learn it 10,000 times more before I die. Because in religious life, in my community, the temptation is always to say, well, I have done enough for the community. Like if I have to empty the dishwasher downstairs in the common room one more time, and then so I always have this kind of narrative with myself, right? Because I'm like the guy that does it often because I'm one of the first ones up. And so it's been run overnight. And so I empty it. But like, I would love for someone else to find it full and clean and to empty it. But no, the point is, I need to be the one to empty it, and I need to just do it. And in doing that, I find the place that I belong and a service that I perform and a way that I participate by dying to myself.
Very real. You added courage, Liz.
Yeah, I think courage is important. And so the reason I wanted to talk about courage is because, I wanted to articulate again the ways that our commitment to abstinence is noticeable, in market. And you have to be brave enough to articulate that to people over and over again, not just ladies that are coming up to you in New York bars, but for that to really be a principle. And it won't do for it to be a kind of half-hearted defense, right? Because the temptation is to hide it, right? So for a Catholic priest, what does that mean? Well, sometimes you just don't want to encounter certain people. You don't have the conversation. So you cover over your collar with a scarf. So you can be a little bit more anonymous. I think the gesture is important, right? Because it symbolizes the way that all of us are tempted to hide the ideals that we're living for in order for them to seem more accessible to someone else. Say like, well, I'm a Catholic, but I'm not that kind of Catholic. And you say like, well, I'm a Latter-day Saint, but I'm not that kind of Latter-day Saint. So that we can put some distance there. But the reality is that we believe these things, and these beliefs leave a mark in our lives such that our lives are different. And instead of allowing and muting that and wanting to shrug it off, we have to lean into that and proclaim it for the kingdom.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. I think sometimes too, we don't realize the gifts of being brave. It feels like a full sacrifice, like a full stop annihilation, but there's actually quite a bit there for you and for others. There's just something that
And
happens
the
in the
first
room.
and Mallory, the first times you do it, right, you think like, do I really believe this? And it can
Totally.
feel like you can feel like an imposter, right? Like you
Right.
feel a little bit fake. You say like, well, I'm not actually as all the way there on this as I would want to be. But then
Mhm.
you like enunciate the principle. And not only do you offer something to the person that you're engaging, but you convict yourself. You say, no,
Mhm.
actually, I do believe this. When you announce it again to yourself, and it becomes the way by which you're able to be faithful to your own principle.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's giving quite a bit back for sure to you, even if
What
it's
would
just
you
that first reflexive thing.
what would be your one sentence answer to somebody who is just like, what is the purpose of you doing this sacrifice? And let's say that it's somebody without a religious
Mhm.
background, right? So just like, why on earth would you do this? How do you explain that?
I My life is dedicated to living as complete an imitation of the life of Jesus Christ as possible.
Yeah.
So we can say very poetically in Latin, we can say imitatio Christi. But that's the only thing that without Jesus, you can announce natural principles, you can bring in the traditions of other religious expressions. But without Jesus Christ and his promulgation of the gospel and the kingdom, it's fundamentally and utterly unintelligible. And so you just have
Mhm.
to say, no, I think this man is who he says he was, and that my life will be worth living and will be full insofar as it's lived in conformity with his.
Yeah. And the love that he had like for humanity. And
Absolutely. That's what I think it demonstrates. That's what it's supposed to
yeah.
image.
Sarah, would you have a similar answer?
If it's a one sentence answer, I would just say, like, I'm already loved more than I can bear. I just think that's true. I don't always feel it, but I know it's true. And I've had at least like glimpses at various points where you're like, oh, okay. And he gives me cat pillows. And they're just ways that God loves me in very individual way. Um, yeah, that's all I would say.
You guys keep making me cry. Yes, I'm sorry.
I know.
I'm a little bit of a crier, but
Me
just
too,
that
girl.
I'm gonna remember that line for a long time. I'm already loved more than I can bear.
Yeah.
Go off,
And
babe.
that's why I wanted to have the conversation because there is something so I know that there's been something so missing in my own understanding of singleness that we also believe in the universal love of Jesus Christ and all of this, but we put so much emphasis on marriage in our tradition that it is just so easy to feel like this is a meaningless state and that it's just kind of sad that it didn't happen to you and to experience it as an absence of love, like
Mm.
that we haven't gotten to experience the highest thing. And that's not to denigrate marriage at all. And of course, there's stuff I'm missing out on, right? But I just appreciate this conversation so much. And we need this so much in our tradition of just a sense of like, no, actually, singleness is an opportunity to rest radically. I liked that word that you used earlier, radically, how totally sufficient the love of God is. And to have people who are dedicated to living that out and reminding people in all of these awkward dates or awkward bar conversations, reminding people of how radically sufficient is the love of God is to sustain us, that we don't need other, not saying we don't need community, but just that sense of love. I really feel that in what you're talking about.
So well said, Diana. You go out on that. That's really good. Genuinely cannot thank you enough, really. This was such a gift. I think our listeners are going to really appreciate it. And if anything, you really impacted both of us today. So thank you. So helpful.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you want to continue the conversation with us, we've got a couple of options for you. You're welcome to email us with any feedback or topic suggestions at hello@thesoloists.org. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our account handle is the.soloists. And if you're not on Instagram, don't let us give you FOMO. Enjoy being unplugged from social media. Thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.